Good evening, or whatever time it happens to be when you watch this. To begin with, I want to apologize for taking some time to produce this video. Unfortunately, while I was in the early stages of preparing, I sustained an accident to my hand while trying to perform a dark ritual of sorts. Be that as it may, I'm back, and I wanted to take this opportunity to count down the top 5 novels that you should be reading during this current time of plague and quarantine. In the number 5 position, I've chosen not actually a horror novel, which is, of course, what I talk about mostly on this channel, but nevertheless a somewhat horrifying novel, and that is the existentialist classic The Plague by Albert Camus. If you haven't read it yet, I don't want to spoil too much, except to say that it's a powerful book, perhaps allegorical, and certainly relevant to these times. In the number 4 spot, I've chosen also not quite a horror novel, more of a thriller, and that's the Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. This is about an alien plague, or an alien infectious disease, let's say. More of a sci-fi thriller than a horror novel, but still relevant, still a good read. In the number 3 spot, I've chosen, in my opinion, one of the greatest horror novels of all time, and that is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is a sort of vampire novel, zombie novel hybrid, whichever way you prefer to think of it. It's definitely about a plague. It's definitely horrifying. One of the best novels you'll ever read. Also a short novel, a very quick read, perfect for reading during these times. In the number 2 position, I've chosen a book that I suspect most of you expect, and that is this doorstop of a book, Stephen King's The Stand. This is a story about a virus that kills the vast majority of the human race, and of the survivors who try to rebuild society afterward. This is a substantial book. Do make sure that you get the uncut edition, even though it's much larger, something like 1,200, what is this? Yeah, just about 1,200 pages long, so it'll take you some time to get through, but it does move at a pretty good pace. Very good book, highly recommended, well worth reading. And before I get to my number 1 choice, I want to focus on a couple of honorable mentions that I've selected. First of those is The Domesday Book by Connie Willis. Not a horror novel at all, not even particularly horrifying. This is a story about the plague during the 14th century and historians investigating that time, and it bridges the past and present in some interesting sci-fi sorts of ways. A good read, well worth your time. My next honorable mention is The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. This is a book ostensibly a true story, although you can't trust its accuracy, but it does demonstrate how a retelling of factual events can be just as horrifying as a novel, even though the author took, shall we say, certain liberties with the truth. Next up, if you're interested in the classics, you could read The Decameron, which is a story of people isolating themselves from the plague, and during that time they tell each other stories, much like we might be trying to do when we read these books. If you're interested in that, you might also read one of the sort of spin-offs of the Decameron, and that is Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. While set during plague times, because Chaucer lived through the plague, this is not really a plague book, but it is one of the foundations of English literature, and because it was written during the plague, seems worth reading nonetheless. And our final honorable mention is Max Brooks' World War Z. This is a zombie novel, not a traditional plague sort of novel, but let's face it, zombies are a sort of plague, and Brooks was specifically inspired by thinking about plagues when he wrote this, so it makes a solid entry into our honorable mentions list. Which brings us to my number 1 choice for the books that we should be reading during quarantine, and that is actually not a book, not a novel, but a short story. It is written by Edgar Allan Poe, and I suspect many of you know where I'm headed with this. The book I've chosen is The Mask of the Red Death. This is a story of people having a sort of party while trying to stay safe from a plague. And without spoiling it, let's just say that things don't turn out particularly well for them. This is a wonderful story. It's a classic for a reason. You can't go wrong with Poe. And let's say certain elements of the story will seem particularly relevant to us during these times. In the meantime, happy reading. Try to stay safe. Try to stay productive during this quarantine. And I will just say, take care and stay scared.